I have directed that the following initial steps be taken immediately. To halt this offensive buildup, a strict quarantine on all offensive military equipment under shipment to Cuba is being initiated. All ships of any kind bound for Cuba, from whatever nation or port, will, if found to contain cargoes of offensive weapons, be turned back. It shall be the policy of this nation to regard any nuclear missile launched from Cuba against any nation in the Western Hemisphere as an attack by the Soviet Union on the United States.
It was the dark of night, but sealed in a windowless van, bumping along the back roads through the Everglades for 3 hours, the 10 men sweltered in the humid South Florida heat. The van stopped. The door flew open to reveal a fishing pier. Scrambling into a launch, they headed out to sea, the breeze a welcome relief, the light of a quarter moon dimly illuminating their destination, a low, overgrown island. There they were met by 3 men with rifles who escorted them to a shack behind the remains of an abandoned resort. This was Giuseppe Island, just off of Florida's west coast near Fort Myers. The date was June 2nd, 1960, and for these 10 Cuban exiles, it was the start of a daring, desperate, and ultimately doomed attempt to reclaim their homeland from communist rule. The next 10 months, these men would be among the leaders of a military assault that became known as the Bay of Pigs invasion. On April 17, 1961, a force of nearly 1,500 men, secretly aided by America's CIA and Navy, would storm southern Cuba in an undercover operation with shockwaves that would still reverberate 60 years later. The 20th century was a time of major political change across the globe, with new radical ideas filling societies, and world power shifting places. By the 1950s, the world's 2 biggest powers began to take shape. The first was the United States, a heavily industrialized country full of nationalism after effectively winning in World War II. The other was a revolutionized Soviet Union, coming off of a very chaotic time in their history, as they adopted strong communist ideas inspired by figures like Karl Marx. This began a conflict, a race of sorts, between the United States and the West versus the Soviet Union and the East. Beginning on New Year's Day 1959, Fidel Castro led guerrilla forces into the capital of Cuba, Havana, leading to the end of the current dictatorship. The story really starts, however, after Cuban independence, where many were desperate to stop foreign influences. This trend can be seen throughout Cuban history and leads us to the 1930s, where presidencies in Cuba had failed, and after a revolution in 1933, Fulgencio Batista was put in power. Batista enacted many reforms in Cuba, but increasingly became corrupt. He retired to the U.S. after his time, although he returned soon after to a deteriorated government. He tried to reinstate himself in power, but ultimately failed, and several rebel groups formed. Many called for a peaceful end to the current government, but others were very different, and after being imprisoned in Mexico for a few years as consequence for his rebellious efforts, Fidel Castro finalized his plans for an uprising and returned to Cuba. He managed to topple the government in 1959, and although he wasn't the official leader yet, it was clear the government was under his control. Castro adopted some communist ideas after meeting Marxist leaders while in Mexico. They helped him gain power and aided him with the rebellion and overthrow of Batista's government, gaining his trust in the process. Also, during this time, the anti-communist rebellion forces had weakened their influence as their peaceful efforts had made little impact in Cuba, leading Castro to adopt communist policies while in power. The Bay of Pigs invasion underwent initial stages of planning under President Eisenhower's administration in March of 1960, with plans for the U.S.-supported insurgents in Cuba evolving into the secret gathering, arming, and training of Cuban exiles by the CIA. After John F. Kennedy took office in 1961, he continued with the operation. However, the CIA underestimated the strength of Castro's forces and his support from the Cuban people. After months of training, on April 17, 1961, 1,500 Cuban exiles with U.S. weapons and U.S. air support landed at the Bay of Pigs near southwest Cuba. Immediately, Castro's land army engaged and pinned their exiles at the landing site, while Castro's air force decimated the exiles supporting airplanes and supply ships. Outnumbered and running out of ammunition, the CIA-trained exiles were surrounded and forced to surrender. Of the 1,500 or so landing force of Cuban exiles, 114 were killed, 1,189 were captured and sent to prison. The rest were either similarly executed or fled to the Cuban countryside, never to be seen again.
Aftermath of the Bay of Pigs invasion was embarrassing for the Kennedy administration. Widespread protests against U.S. foreign policy occurred, and U.S.-Cuban relations further soured. On the other hand, the Bay of Pigs invasion gave Castro an impetus to align Cuba closer to the Soviet Union, priming the world for the Cuban Missile Crisis. When Castro contacted the USSR for military aid, Nikita Khrushchev, premier of the Soviet Union, welcomed it. Afterwards, despite the warnings of his senior advisors, Khrushchev decided to place medium-range ballistic missiles in Cuba. Specifically, after the proposal was finalized in June 1962, 40 SS-4 ballistic missiles with ranges up to 1,600 miles were to be sent. The transfer of all this equipment and personnel was to be conducted in complete secrecy. Soviet weapons began arriving in Cuba by late July of 1962, with construction of bases and launch sites beginning in August. American U-2 reconnaissance planes picked up signs of Soviet weapons buildup, prompting JFK to publicly warn the Soviets from putting nuclear missiles in Cuba on September 13th. Then on October 14th, 1962, a U-2 photographed the medium-range ballistic missile launch site for SS-4 missiles. Using intelligence from a Soviet defector, Oleg Penkovsky, the site could be identified by U.S. agencies. In the days after the discovery, the Soviets still repeatedly denied the existence of nuclear missiles in Cuba, as American troops amassed in military bases. On October 22, 1962, Kennedy gave a televised public address and disclosed the presence of ballistic missiles in Cuba. He pressured the Soviet Union to withdraw their forces and missiles from Cuba and established a naval blockade around the entirety of Cuba. On October 24th, the U.S. military was placed on DEFCON 2 for the first and only time, with its nuclear capabilities on constant high alert. The next day, Soviet ships stopped short of the blockade, resulting in a tense standoff. On October 26, Khrushchev offered to remove the missiles if the U.S. promised not to invade Cuba. October 27, Kennedy resists his advisor's proposal to strike against Cuban missile sites. A U-2 plane was shot over Cuba, killing pilot Rudolf Anderson. The same day, Vasily Arkhipov defied his crew members and decided not to authorize a nuclear attack against American ships, which would have almost certainly led to nuclear war. On October 28, the United States and the Soviet Union agreed on the withdrawal of missiles from Cuba in exchange for the withdrawal of U.S. nuclear missiles from Turkey and for the Americans not to invade Cuba, thus ending the Cuban Missile Crisis. Perspectives of the U.S., USSR, and Cuba of the Cuban Missile Crisis differ immensely in their ideology, attitude, and reasoning. Castro believed that the missiles could be used to end capitalism and American, quote, imperialistic aggressions. Castro also believed that the Soviet Union's removal of the missiles was a betrayal and that they used Cuba as a pawn. The Soviet Union justified its decision to send nuclear missiles to defend Cuba from another U.S. invasion. They also believed that it was fair, as the U.S. also had missiles in other countries. To Kennedy, the primary geopolitical rival of the U.S. had placed offensive nuclear weapons in close proximity to the U.S. mainland. The Cuban Missile Crisis brought about multiple long-term consequences. It contributed to Khrushchev's fall from power a few years later. The crisis induced the two superpowers to revise their policy of brinkmanship and disarmament to prevent similar crises. The crisis also eventually saw the ban on atmospheric nuclear bomb testing, as well as the Washington-Moscow hotline. The Pigs invasion was a misstep by the U.S. government that almost led to the entire world falling. The Cuban Missile Crisis was the closest instance where two superpowers nearly deliberately instigated thermonuclear war, only de-escalating at the end. The Cuban Missile Crisis was an international issue, leading to the institution of more safeguards and treaties against nuclear war. The invasion and the crisis provide examples relevant to the current day, where a relatively isolated event could lead to catastrophe for all.